Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
In these days, Black Lives Matter and Trumpism, a new novel explores the lives of two characters across what W.E.B. Du Bois called the color line. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Author Michael Coffino has written a new novel entitled The Truth is in the House, which tells the story of two men. Jimmy O'Farrell, whose family comes to America from Ireland, and Jalen Jackson, whose family escapes Mississippi. And we have the author on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Much thanks, Don. Nice to be here.
So, first of all, what was the inspiration to this book in terms of particularly the two characters? Because there's a reference to the fact that you do have some real-life background stuff that you then sort of drew upon.
Right. I actually set out to write a different kind of book. I wanted my first novel to be in celebration of growing up in the Bronx. And I started out interviewing two childhood friends who I hadn't seen in 50 years. I had connected with them on Facebook. And they told me about these twin homicides that occurred at a bar in the neighborhood when I was in the military in 1970, and I hadn't heard about it. I knew the two kids who were killed, and I was completely blown away by it. And so I started to look at it more carefully, and I contacted the police station. They were able to find the cold file, and there was a racial confrontation in the bar. And so I was intrigued by that, and then I did some more research, and I came across another event not too far from the neighborhood, a gang attack, which is also racially based. So it was like kind of a turf war. And so I decided at that point to go in a different direction, that I would write a story about race using two characters that would be sort of a metaphor for their particular journeys and their cultural backgrounds, Jimmy O'Farrell and Jalen Jackson, and they became the vehicles for the narrative. And from there, other than, those two actual events, the story grew organically.
So then let's turn to Jimmy O'Farrell. He comes from Ireland. Tell me a little bit about why you made that decision for him to come from there. And it, in many ways, the neighborhood that you described seems very much like an average sort of white ethnic neighborhood.
The O'Farrell family they were 1950s immigrants. They were looking for a better life. The book doesn't go into great detail about it, though it just covers it. He had a kind of a hard scrabble life in Ireland, and the father wanted to come for a new beginning. So they come here, and it's a little more complicated, as it turns out. There's a lot of migration going on in the neighborhoods, and the wife has a lot of fears about that. And so they actually they move themselves, and then they wind up having this tragedy that happens in the gang attack, which leaves the kid dead and Jimmy scarred. And that sort of creates his character and his life mission. So that was their context. And, they eventually wind up in the Bronx in a neighborhood called Highbridge, which is where I grew up. And meanwhile, the Jackson family is having their own travails in Jim Crow land, Mississippi, and there's tragedy there, and they wind up migrating to the north in the Bronx. And now these two boys who have yet to meet are in neighboring communities, and they eventually have an intersection, first as basketball players out on the playground, and then for the rest of their lives. So that's kind of, and the neighborhood, Highbridge, is pretty accurately described in terms of what it was like for me growing up there. I've had pretty good responses from people who grew up there so far to the book. But yeah, whether it's typical, I can't speak to that, but it was how it was when I was growing up.
And by the way, I want to turn to Jalen Jackson and his family, because one of the things that struck me, and you spend a good deal of time actually about his family's time in Mississippi, and of course his father disappears. A lot of it reminded me of another book, which was Warmth of Other Suns, which of course was about the migration of African Americans from the south to the north. Tell me a little bit about how you began to characterize that period, and at least from what I can tell, fairly accurate in the sense of the kind of tension and fear, as it were, during that sort of Jim Crow period.
Yeah, I felt at a disadvantage initially. I kind of had a sense of where I was going to go with it, but so I spent an enormous amount of time researching. I've read countless books looked at a number of documentaries, YouTube stuff, and interviewed people. I interviewed about 30 people for the book, ultimately. And that was a goal. I mean, I'm glad you pointed that out. I appreciate that, because one of the things I wanted to do was not be historically inaccurate. Even though it was a work of fiction, I knew I had some freedom to create scenes and a narrative that didn't necessarily hold true to what other people might have experienced. So it needed to be essentially true. And so I did spend a lot of time understanding the dynamics of growing up as a person of color in Mississippi in that time period, and then created scenes. Some of them are inspired by stories I've read. Some are just created whole cloth. But I did spend a lot of time trying to figure that out.
So when the Jackson family gets to the Bronx, describe for me how you came about in terms of describing the kind of neighborhood that they were living in.
Well, I mean, it was autobiographical. I mean, I grew up, in a neighborhood that initially was pretty much, it wasn't integrated at the time. It became very integrated eventually, but at the time it was mostly white Europeans. It was a fairly good Puerto Rican population there, but we grew up in the streets. We played the street games, and that was ours. We had a subculture that was untethered really from school and church and family and that thing. And one of the things I was most proud of, which really was the initial motivation for the book, was to celebrate that subculture, making our own rules, creating our own dynamics among each other, and we had our own community. So it wasn't really difficult creating that context because I lived it. I lived it for several years. I mean, I didn't leave New York until I was 27, and I lived in the Bronx all that time.
So one of the things that brings these two young men together, is basketball. Talk a little bit about the importance of sports and race and how they interconnect.
It's a great question. I don't know if you saw it in my biographical background, but I coached high school basketball for over 20 years, and I played, obviously, a lot of basketball growing up in the Bronx. Played year of college, and I always felt, and I've written on the subject. I've written on high school athletics, and I've written on basketball in terms of strategy and stuff like that. I've always felt that it was a microcosm of neutrality, where people can get together and have a greater good, a greater sort of common bond together in terms of the love of the game and the competition, completely removed, or at least largely removed, from the kind of stuff that we return to after we're done. And in the book, there's a scene, it's called The Game, and it's actually based on a true story. When I was in high school playing ball in the neighborhood, I put together a game pitting our neighborhood, Highbridge, against another neighborhood in the Bronx, which was largely Hispanic. And so we had this organized scrimmage, and it was a completely SRO situation. We had just hundreds of people surrounding, and we had referees and a whole bit, but it was a playground scrimmage. And that scene is fictionalized in the book, and to depict where you can have situations where you rise above the racial divide, the color line, as you pointed out in the beginning. There is a moment in that scene where there's a confrontation that is racially motivated, and that has implications. It's sort of a little forecasting for the book. Not to get too much into that right now, but it does forecast things that happen in the book later on. But I always felt that sports has a higher purpose than a lot of things we do in terms of the values that it brings to the fore. I try to use that a little bit in the book to bring that out.
Well, let me ask about the sports issue, because how much, particularly from your own personal experience, how much can sports overcome that racial line? I mean, you do have, say, for instance, you may have two teams who are obviously of different ethnic backgrounds, and they're going to identify with their particular group. Is there a way for them to reach across do they reach across as individuals? Do they reach across as groups? What sense do you get about that?
Really, that's an insightful question, frankly. I think, let me go kind of 30,000 feet with that one and come back down. one of the things I try to point out in the book, I mean, kind of the sort of drive of the book is that on an individual basis, we can do better. That obviously, if you believe in systemic racism, the solutions are more infrastructure-based. They're more significant, long-term, and a book is not going to do anything to make that happen. But we can do better individually. And so what I hope readers take away from the book is a little self-introspection about how they see their world and how they see others in their world and what they can do better by being more empathetic and that sort of thing. And I think sports helps there. Now, obviously, when the games are over, we all go back to our cultures and those heavy influences. And so I'm not naive about that. But I do believe one of the things that was great for me growing up was, there was a 2 or 3 year period where my neighborhood was totally integrated. And the common bond between and among us all was basketball. And so we could hang with each other after games. We could get to know each other. We could socialize and feel comfortable with each other in a way that we otherwise couldn't if we didn't have sports to facilitate that. So I don't know about the group level that you mentioned. I think that's a little more difficult, more complicated. But I do believe that if you engage in athletics for a long period of time, particularly in the high school period of your life, you are more comfortable dealing with people who come from different places and different origins, whose skin color is different than yours. It does help to be able to be comfortable and get rid of the fears and anxieties that some sort of the racial biases we all seem to have, cause. I think it can happen and does happen.
You remind me, by the way, of Jack Kemp, who played football and felt very comfortable in his own skin, even though he was a Republican and so on and so forth. But he certainly felt far more comfortable in some of his political compatriots in the Republican Party. I want to turn back now to the military service because you go from what you're describing there to a military, particularly in Vietnam, which was clearly laced with racism.
Yeah. The people have asked me about that part of the book in terms of whether I think the military can be a vehicle for change when it comes to racial relationships. And, I think obviously it's regressed, to be honest with you. I mean, the military did break the color line early. Probably, I think maybe the first of all our institutions. But the reality is that there is, they also have the common good of working together, the brotherhood, that sort of thing. And I use the Marines for that in the book. Yeah, but I think that the reality is, again, it's a temporary thing. We go back to our cultural influences, and now in our current situation, we've regressed. I think people have seen how much white supremacists have infiltrated the military and the challenges the military now has internally. In theory, the potential is there, obviously, because they have the missions rise above, the racial divides. And in fact, there's a scene or two in the book that we get to that. But the reality is that Jalen Jackson experiences the racism is rampant. And because you can't change people overnight, right? So if people come from where they come from, they get together with strangers, and they are who they are. Obviously, in the field, in the force of fire and battle, it's a different situation where everyone is out to protect each other. But once the firing starts, the battle subsides, we're back to who we are.
Right, because you mentioned, and you note, for instance, that there were Confederate flags and people identified the KKK and that kind of thing
right
within that, so that particularly, I think it's Jalen, he's clearly aware of this divide that perhaps he didn't, from the novel, it's almost as seems as if he, I don't know whether surprise is quite the right word, but certainly it certainly was more stark to him, I think, particularly when he went overseas.
Yeah, he has this great scene where he, when he's still in college, playing college basketball, and he's injured, and he runs into this recruiting Marine in Florida, and he has this sense that he can gain respect that doesn't basically account for the color of his skin through the military. So that's kind of his motivation going in, but he learns quickly that that's naive, and that it's not going to happen that way, and that he's got to find other ways to do it, which is his long journey. That's his life journey, is to connect with himself and others in a way in which he has respect as a human being. But yeah, so he learns the hard way, and he learns. Actually, his educational curve is better than Jimmy's in that regard. He gets it earlier, and he tries to bring Jimmy along, and he fails initially. But it's definitely a challenge for him, and a great disappointment for him through the military experience.
Hey, you mentioned that, I think, in referring to Jalen, I think you write, after wallowing so long in sheer madness thousands of miles from home, the last thing Jalen wants is returning to a country falling apart from racial discord. It seems that when he returned, he found the same thing or found something similar than what he learned, say, in Vietnam.
Yeah, he understands at this point in his journey now that he's going to come home to a different kind of reception than Jimmy is, and they're both war heroes. They both went in there for different reasons. They're both motivated to become better people, but the odds are different. And he gets it right away that he's going to go back, and he has a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, which causes him to make a very serious error in judgment down the road, getting up towards the denouement scene in the book. But he understands that the odds are stacked against him, and he's got to confront that and find a way through it. It takes him a while to figure it out, but he gets there.
I want to turn now to the incident in the bar. Tell me a little bit about that and what you were trying to describe there in terms of the tensions between the various individuals.
Well, the bar scene is based on an actual event. It's not. I mean, it's fictionalized, obviously, but that was the inspiration for it. And I did it. I actually were able to find people who were around at that time. Everyone has their own take on it, but to me, the chapter before that scene sets it up because what I was trying to lay out in terms of how this impacts Jimmy O'Farrell, that he's part of a culture, a neighborhood culture that's impacting him. He doesn't necessarily buy into everything, but he's influenced by it. And the question is going to become when he's confronted with, again, if that's where the truth is in the house moment materializes, is how is he going to respond? And that bar is sort of like a protective haven for the community, the white Irish community, some of the influences that are beginning to circulate around culturally at the time. Now, this is now the 1970s. We're in the midst of major social and cultural change, and those things are starting to bear down on it. The bar is kind of a haven, right? And so it has values and it has expectations, and those impact him. And the question to him is going to be, how are those going to impact how he deals with Jalen in that moment, and we'll see how it works out. But I wanted that situation to become more than simply, a guy walking into the bar and getting harassed. I wanted to have a much more significant reading about the influences of culture and community on decisions and behavior.
Because Jimmy seems to be forced to confront this color line, I guess, as we describe it, because this is somebody who he certainly relates to on the one hand, and obviously we have the court scenes later on, but he's almost seemed to be confronted with this dichotomy that he is seeming to live with. That on the one hand, he certainly connects with this person. On the other hand, at least in the past, and yet at the same time, he's confronted by the racism of the time.
Yeah, Jimmy. I'm talking about Jimmy now. Jimmy, he started to deal with the conflict inside of him. He was, when Jalen first calls him on the racial issue in Vietnam, he's naive. He still sees the thing from a Pollyannish perspective. But the scene in the bar wakes him up, even though he fails in the moment. And it does cause him to have his own self-introspection. And he begins to figure things out eventually. But it takes a very painful and fatalistic moment for it to happen. And then he goes off on his own sort of mission at that point. That's kind of been his thing from the beginning. But he too, he doesn't quite get everything until later on. It takes him a while. But that scene in the bar is sort of like a jolt to his consciousness. And he realizes that he really screwed up and that he made a mistake. And he tries to make up for it later with mixed results.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, there's a criminal investigation that occurs as a result of what happens, and
Right.
there's a court hearing, a preliminary hearing, and those. I mean, not to get too steeped into the legal stuff, but he's a witness, and he's called upon to basically help the prosecution prosecute Jalen, right, and others. And so he's in a situation where he's done. It's the second time he's been on a witness stand in his life. He had the earlier incident with the gang attack when he was much younger, so this is not his first rodeo in a criminal courtroom. But he's struggling with it. He's struggling. He wants to do. The prosecution is leading him by the hand to where the prosecutor wants to go, and he's not resisting it heavily, but he knows he's being manipulated, and he has this sort of epiphany moment, which I want to tell your readers and audience the details of it. He has an epiphany moment,
Yeah.
and it's really a courtroom scene that doesn't really happen very often, but I wanted to use it as a mechanism for the sort of subconscious process that he's going through to resolve the deep conflicts he's having.
They obviously, much later on in their lives, see each other. Is there a reconciliation between these two men in the end, do you think?
I think so. I think there's a little uncertainty that's left, but I think people would draw their own conclusions from it. I mean, one of the responses I've gotten, which I didn't really anticipate as much, but it's been really refreshing and heartening, is that people have appreciated the friendship narrative here. And in fact, I actually got one of my awards for the book is in the friendship category, which was completely unanticipated. And so I think that, reconciliation is a powerful word. I think sometimes we can reconcile and still have some doubts and concerns and anxieties about, the subject matter or the person we're dealing with. But I think, because each man finds truth for themselves in terms of how they relate to other people and each other, I think it's a powerful reconciliation. But, the ending is a little unclear, I think.
Now, you've written this book in a time of certainly a heightened racial divide. We'll see how that all plays out. How do you see this book in terms of the times that we live in, this moment in time?
That's a pretty large question. I don't want to be immodest about it. I mean, I think that what I tried to do was what I alluded to earlier, which is I wanted to, once I figured out where I was going, and I didn't really know where I was going for a while. It was really chapter to chapter, character development happening on the fly, to be honest. But once I figured out exactly where I was headed, one of the things I wanted to accomplish, and one of the things I hope readers take away from it, is how we individually can change. We individually can adjust and make things better in our daily lives. I'm not talking about infrastructure and structural changes, the systemic stuff, just individually. And what it requires for me, and this was a learning experience for me writing the book, is you need to have self-honesty. I firmly believe we all have racial bias, every one of us, because we've grown up in this culture. And there's just no way around that. But the question is, it doesn't necessarily make us bad or malevolent, but it does make us sort of beholden to truth. And once we figure out what our personal truth is in that regard, and we are open to other people's visions and how they see the world and become more empathetic to them, then we're in a better place. And so the thing I wanted to accomplish ultimately in the current environment was a slightly different perspective. I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on now, and it's getting very heavy. I mean, all this stuff about trying to eliminate teachings in schools and stuff. So we're at a pretty tough time, and that's a higher level policy stuff and maybe even legislative levels. But individually, relationships with people, I think we can do better, and that's kind of what hopefully the book will get people to think about. That's the context in which I wrote it.
Do you think in terms of this person-to-person connection and the exposure, obviously, to others, I mean, we not only exposure to others in terms of our individual contacts, but we also see, in the media, for example, and I've always struck by this recently, that there is a tremendous multicultural set of images that are now cutting across, for instance, television screens and other places. I mean, I'm watching the Olympics, which seems far more diverse than I think I've ever seen it before, that we're beginning to perhaps get to know ourselves, even as the demographics change.
It's like when you travel. I mean, people who travel are exposed to so much more than what their lives have every day. And the first time I went, when I was practicing international law as a lawyer, I spent a lot of time in Europe and Asia on business, and I was just completely changed by the experiences I had. It opened my eyes to how other people live, how they see the world, how parochial I was, how limited I was in my perspective. And I just think that the more contact you have with people on a day-to-day basis, the humanity can't be resisted if you're open to it. And it's like someone who writes an email. It's easy to write an email and say something, that may be critical or negative or harsh. Try doing that in person, right? So I think the human connection part is the key. And that's, at the end of the day, another person told me they thought the book was spiritual in that regard. I don't know if I'd go there, but I get that. I get what they're saying, the human connection part. And so I do believe that's the way forward for each of us, on a day-to-day basis.
You said that early in the interview that you felt as if sometimes we've stepped back a bit in terms of reconciliation. Are you optimistic about the future when it comes to race and that particular issue?
I actually am, guardedly. I think there's a lot of work that has to be done. I think we're in an environment of fear and divisiveness right now, unlike anything we've seen at least in recent times. I grew up in the 60s, so I was in that part of that era when things were changing, but now it's gotten so divisive and so fearful and distrustful that it's easy to be bleak and pessimistic. But I get that, and the people who talk about that, I can't really argue with them. But I am optimistic. I think we're seeing, sort of like a major change that's going to balance itself out. And I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime, to be honest, but I think we'll get there. It's going to take a while.
Do you think your book will help in that regard?
I don't know. I don't know. I'd hope it would help. Look, if my book impacts individuals, even a handful of them, in a way in which I'm talking about, it would be a huge success to me. Huge success.
So you have anything on tap coming up that you're going to be writing?
I just started my next novel, and it's literally in the first chapter phase. And I'm also studying how to write screenplays because I want to turn Truth Is in the House into a screenplay. That will take a little bit longer because I don't want to jump into that. I want to learn the process first, and I'm taking classes. I got a bunch of books, and I'm being diligent about it first. But yeah, those are the two major projects that I have on the hopper now.
Well, we've been speaking with Michael Coffino. He has written a new novel called Truth Is in the House, which tells the story of two men, Jimmy O'Farrell, whose family comes from from Ireland and comes to America, and then Jalen Jackson, whose family escapes Mississippi, and they find themselves in the Bronx. And we appreciate you writing the book and actually taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.